The first thing Maya Collins noticed was the handshake. It lasted too long. Not in the warm way of old friends who are genuinely happy to see each other, but in the careful, deliberate way of two people who needed to look like old friends. Elliot Crane held Victor Harlow's hand with both of his, for exactly 3 seconds too many, his face fixed in a wide smile, his eyes doing something entirely different from what his mouth was doing. Maya was standing at the server station 10 feet away. She had a clean wine glass in her hand and a polishing cloth pressed against it, and she had been polishing that same glass for the last 40 seconds, which was 35 seconds longer than it needed. Her hands were moving, but her eyes were on table 14. She set the glass down and picked up another. Victor Harlow had come in at 3 minutes past 8, unhurried, without any noise, flanked by 2 men who moved the way people move when their job is to be aware of a room at all times. Victor himself was tall, with the kind of physical stillness that most people never achieve. He did not look around when he entered. He walked directly to table 14, greeted Crane, sat down, and placed both hands flat on the table. He was perhaps in his late 40s. His face was composed in a way that was not unfriendly, but it was not open either. It was the face of a man who had learned, over a long time, not to give himself away. Maya had known his name before tonight. 3 weeks ago, a guest at table 7 had left behind a business magazine, and she had read it during her break in the small staff room at the back of the restaurant. There was a long profile of Victor Harlow inside it, the kind of profile that was written with a mixture of admiration and wary respect. Harlow Capital was described as one of the most quietly influential investment firms in the country, a company that moved money and shaped outcomes without appearing in headlines. Victor himself was described in one particular sentence that she had read twice and then a third time. Before founding his company, Harlow spent 11 years in a branch of government service that he has never publicly named, and about which he has never, in any interview, said a single word. She had thought about that sentence on her drive home. She thought about what 11 years of unnamed government service might look like, what it might do to a person, what it might teach them. She was thinking about it again now. Elliot Crane had arrived at 7:55, 5 minutes before Victor, and had already been seated when Victor came in. Crane was perhaps 50 years old, with silver at his temples and a suit that had been fitted to him by someone who knew what they were doing. He was the kind of man who looked like he belonged in rooms like this one, polished and smooth and perfectly placed. He had been Victor's senior business partner for 7 years. They had built Harlow Capital together from an early stage, back when it was a 2-desk office, and a belief that most people in the industry did not share. That was the story. That was what the magazine had said. But the man who sat across from Victor now, and smiled that 3-second too long smile, was doing something that the magazine had not described. He was managing an expression, rather than simply having one. And that was a very different thing. Maya moved from the station to table 2, where the anniversary couple, 23 years, the wife had told her when they arrived, and the husband had reached across the table and held her hand when she said it, were finishing their second course. She checked in with them, refilled their water, noted that they were happy and relaxed, and moved back toward the station. As she did, she let her eyes travel the length of the room, the way her father had taught her to scan a space. Not quickly, not daringly, just steadily, the way you read a paragraph from left to right, taking it all in, without stopping on any one word. The bar was at the far end of the dining room, separated from the tables by a low partition of frosted glass. On Friday evenings, the bar was usually occupied by people having drinks before a dinner booking, or people who had decided that a drink was the whole evening, and that was perfectly fine. The bartender, a quiet man named Charlie who had been at the Meridian almost as long as Maya, moved behind the bar with his own version of steady efficiency. And at the far right end of the bar, 2 men sat with drinks in front of them. She had noticed them when she first came on shift at 6 o'clock. She had registered them the way she registered everyone in the room at the start of an evening, quickly, cataloging, filing them away. 2 men at the bar, drinks ordered, nothing unusual. She noticed them now with considerably more attention. The first was broad across the shoulders, somewhere in his mid-40s, with a dark jacket and short, tightly cropped hair that was going gray at the sides. The second was younger, perhaps early 30s, slimmer, with a dark jacket that matched the first man's in a way that was either coincidence or not. Both of them had drinks in front of them. Neither of them was drinking with any frequency. The younger man had his phone resting face down on the bar. Every few minutes, he touched the edge of it with one finger. Not picking it up, not checking it, just touching it. The older man had not moved his glass in the last 8 minutes. Most people at a bar on a Friday evening in a restaurant like the Meridian were relaxed. They talked to the bartender or to whoever they had come with. They looked at the menu. They looked at the other tables. They drank. These two men were not doing any of those things with the ease that comes naturally to people who are simply out for a drink. They were seated in a way that gave them a clear, unobstructed view of the dining floor, and particularly of the area where table 14 sat. Maya stood at the station and reached for the cloth on the lower shelf, the one she used to wipe down the polished wood of the counter, and she began doing this slowly and carefully, while her eyes stayed soft and unfocused, the way her father had taught her to watch something without appearing to watch it. Owen Collins had been a detective for 22 years. He had joined the department when he was 24 years old, and had worked his way through every level of the plainclothes division, before his heart gave out on a Tuesday morning, when Maya was 19. She had been in her second week of her first year of college. Her mother Sandra had called, and Maya had sat on the floor of the dorm hallway for a long time before she could move. She had taken a leave of absence and gone home, and she had never entirely gone back to college the way she had meant to. She had come back to it slowly, part-time, fitting one course per semester around her shifts at the Meridian, working toward a criminal justice degree that was 3 credits from complete. Owen Collins had never once sat down and formally lectured his daughter. He had taught her everything she knew about reading a room, reading a person, reading a situation, by simply talking through what he saw as he saw it, in the car, at the dinner table, waiting in a queue at the grocery store. He had an unhurried observational quality that she had absorbed without realizing she was absorbing it. She thought about him now, standing at the station with the cloth in her hands. She thought about the way he used to sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a manila folder, going through case notes, and the way he would sometimes say out loud to no one in particular, "Everything tells you something, if you are paying attention. Nothing is random. People think they are hiding things and what they are actually doing is rearranging them." She looked at the broad-shouldered man at the bar. She looked at the way his jacket fell across his left side. She knew that shape. She had known that shape from childhood. Her father had worn his service weapon under his left arm for 22 years, and the weight of it did something specific to the fall of a jacket. The left side sat slightly lower. The fabric pulled in a particular direction when the shoulder moved. It was a shape that her brain had stored long ago without being asked to, filed somewhere in the back of her memory alongside the smell of coffee and the sound of case files being shuffled. The man at the bar was carrying something under his left arm. The polishing cloth in Maya's hand went still. She made herself start moving again. Slow, steady strokes on the counter. She breathed through her nose, counted 4 beats, breathed out. Her heart was doing something faster than it should have been, but her hands and her face were doing what they always did, their jobs. She looked at the main course ticket coming up in the pass-through from the kitchen. Table 14 was on it. She needed to take out the food. She straightened her apron, loaded the tray with careful hands, and walked across the floor. She set down Victor's plate first, then the associates, then Crane's. She asked if everything looked right. Victor glanced down at his plate and said yes. It looked excellent, thank you. Crane said something to Victor about a bottle of wine they had once had together at a dinner in another city, a conversational bridge, a warm and practiced one. Victor smiled at it. The smile did not reach his eyes. Maya walked back toward the station. She was passing by the table adjacent to 14, an empty table that had been vacated 20 minutes ago and not yet reset, and she allowed herself to move a little slowly past it, straightening the chairs on the near side with small adjustments that were unnecessary, and gave her an extra 4 or 5 seconds close to table 14. She heard the words clearly. Not all of them, but 3. She heard Crane say, in a low, steady voice that was pitched for Victor's ears only, "The Romano arrangement holds." She did not stop walking. She did not look up. She continued to the station, set down the empty tray, and stood very still with both hands on the counter's edge. Romano. The name moved through her like cold water. Owen Collins had kept his case files at home, in a gray metal box under the bed in the spare room. He had brought work home more than he should have, and Sandra had never been entirely happy about it, but he was the kind of man who needed to think through his cases at all hours, and the gray box under the bed was where he did it. After he died, Sandra had left it there for years. She had not been able to move it, and Maya, coming home on weekends from her classes, had sometimes opened it in the evenings, not to investigate anything, just to sit with something of her father's. She had read the name Romano in that box. Not once, several times. There were notes in her father's handwriting about a man named Leonard Romano, a fixer, a man who worked in the space between the legal world and the world where legality was a convenience rather than a principle. Her father had written about Romano with the particular kind of terse precision he used when a subject frustrated him: short sentences, circled details, question marks drawn hard enough to leave an impression on the next page. The case had apparently gone nowhere. The file had ended abruptly, mid-investigation, with a single line that she remembered now with sharp clarity. Subject has relocated. Trail ends here for now. She stood at the station with her hands on the counter. That name was at table 14. Elliot Crane, the long-standing partner of Victor Harlow, had just said that a Romano arrangement was in place, and two men who were not here for dinner were sitting at the far end of the bar, with eyes on table 14. Maya looked at the folder that Crane had set on the table earlier, the manila one that he had laid between himself and Victor, and put his hand flat on top of. Victor had not yet touched it, but Crane was reaching toward it now. He opened the cover, smoothly, and slid it a few inches across the tablecloth toward Victor. He said something with the easy confidence of a man who had prepared every word in advance. He leaned forward just slightly. His posture was the posture of a man approaching the moment he had been building toward for a long time. Victor looked at the folder. At the bar, the older man set his glass down on the counter and turned his head by the smallest degree toward table 14. Crane, without looking up, gave the smallest nod that could still be called a nod. Maya's fingers pressed hard into the edge of the counter. She had been looking for certainty. Her father's kind, not proof, but pattern, not suspicion, but the accumulation of enough detail that the shape of a thing became clear. The shape was clear now. She reached into her front apron pocket. Her fingers found the red pen that she kept there every shift, the one she used to circle errors on order tickets and write notes to the kitchen when something needed to be changed. Her father had kept a red pen behind his ear for most of his working life. She had adopted the habit without thinking about it, and she had never once been through a shift without one. She wrapped her hand around it. Her thoughts were very clear. Her breathing was even. Her face, she was certain, showed only the composed attentiveness of a waitress who was watching to see if anything was needed at the tables. Something was about to happen at table 14. She did not know exactly what, and she did not know exactly when. But the folder was open. Victor had not yet signed whatever was inside it, and the two men at the bar had received their signal from Crane. She had the pen. She had a receipt. She looked at the table. She looked at the clock above the kitchen pass-through. She looked at Victor Harlow sitting calmly across from the man who had arranged something with Leonard Romano. She had seconds, not minutes. She moved toward the server station's printer, where the evening's receipts were queuing up in a small, steady stack. She pulled one out. She turned it over. And she began to think, very clearly and very quickly, about exactly what she was going to write. The receipt was thin in her fingers, the kind of paper that curls slightly at the edges from the heat of the printer, and Maya held it against the counter's edge with her left hand, while her right hand moved the red pen across the back of it. She did not hesitate over the words. This surprised her a little, even in the moment. She had expected her mind to argue with itself, to weigh and measure and second-guess, but it did not. The words came clearly and without delay, the same way a person in a very cold situation finds that their body simply moves, overriding the part of the brain that would otherwise slow things down with questions. She wrote 3 lines. She drew a firm circle around each one. Then she straightened up, slid the receipt into the black leather bill folder that was already prepared with Victor's card from the reservation details George Palmer had entered at the start of the evening, and she pressed the folder closed with both hands. She stood at the station for exactly 2 more seconds. In those 2 seconds, she went through the alternatives one final time, the way her father had always insisted on doing before acting on anything. He called it clearing the field, making sure you were not about to act in a way that made things worse because you had not stopped to ask whether there was a better option sitting right next to the one you had chosen. She could go to George Palmer. She could tell him what she had seen and heard. George was a capable manager. a steady man who ran the floor without drama. But she could see George at the far end of the restaurant, by the entrance, speaking with a couple about their booking. He was 3 minutes away from her under normal circumstances, and she would have to interrupt him, pull him aside, and explain in whispered detail everything she had observed, everything she had heard, everything she had recognized and why. 3 minutes, possibly 5. Victor Harlow did not have 5 minutes. She could call the police. She had her phone in the back of her apron pocket, but she had played this out once already in her mind while she was writing on the receipt, and it moved too slowly. A call would take time, an explanation would take more. Dispatch would have questions. The caller confirmation, the address, the nature of the emergency. All of it would take more time than the folder was going to sit on the table before Victor opened it. She could approach the table directly and speak to Victor in plain terms. She could lean down and say, quietly, that she needed a moment of his time. But she had looked at the two men at the bar 3 times in the last 7 minutes, and both times they had been watching the dining floor. If she approached the table and spoke to Victor in any way that was not entirely normal server behavior, they would see it. She did not know what they would do. She did not want to be the person who found out. The bill folder was the only option that was invisible. Servers delivered bill folders to tables at the end of a meal. Servers placed them in front of guests without comment, and guests opened them in their own time. And nothing about this drew any attention from anyone else in the room. A bill folder was the most invisible thing she could put in Victor Harlow's hand. She picked it up. She crossed the dining floor. The distance from the server station to table 14 was not far. Under ordinary circumstances, she walked it perhaps 20 times per shift without noticing. Tonight, each step felt like something she was consciously choosing to take. The room around her was exactly as it always was. The low amber light, the white tablecloths, the soft murmur of conversation from other tables, the clean smell of the kitchen when a swing door opened and closed. Everything the same. And her, crossing through it carrying a folded piece of paper that said something no one at that table was going to expect. She reached table 14. She had been working at the Meridian for 3 years. She had walked to hundreds of tables in those 3 years, had delivered bills and menus and courses and sometimes the small, careful comfort of another glass of water to someone who looked like they needed a moment. She had learned to carry herself in a way that was present without being intrusive, there without being obvious. She used all of that now. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, keeping her voice at exactly the same register she always used at this table, and every other one. "Would you like the bill now, or should I come back a little later?" Crane looked up. He had the impatience of a man who has been interrupted at the wrong moment, though he covered it with a practiced glance toward Victor, deferring. Victor looked at her. She had been looking at his face from across the room all evening, and up close, he was both what she expected and something she had not anticipated. His eyes were very still, not still in the way of a person who was bored or vacant, but still in the way of a person who was entirely present and who knew it. He looked at her, the way a person looks at something when they are actually seeing it, not just registering it. "Yes," he said, "that's fine. Thank you." She set the folder down in front of him. She used both hands to place it, the way she always did, and as she straightened up, she allowed herself 1 second of direct eye contact. 1 second. No longer. The length of time between one heartbeat and the next. Then she turned and walked back toward the station. She did not look back. She went to her other tables. The anniversary couple had reached dessert and were sharing something with 2 spoons, and she asked if there was anything else they needed. There was not. The family group in the corner was requesting the bill, and she went to the station to print it. Her hands did the work they knew how to do, and her mind was somewhere else entirely. She was thinking about what would happen when Victor opened that folder. There were several possibilities, and she had arranged them in her mind, without being able to rank them well. He might open it quickly and see the card, take out the card without turning the receipt over, sign, close the folder, and leave. That was a possibility. People did not always examine their receipts closely. They checked the total. Sometimes they left a comment, and they signed. The message on the back would go unread. He might open it, take out the card, see the receipt turned upside down in the folder, and simply not pick it up. That was also possible. He might read it and think that the waitress at his table had lost her mind and should be spoken to immediately, at which point he would either call her back over or call George over, and either way the men at the bar would know that something unexpected had happened at table 14. Or he might read it. And he might understand it. And he might be the kind of man, specifically the kind of man who had spent 11 years doing something unnamed for the government, who knew what to do with information like that. She was betting on the last one. She was betting on the last one. She was betting on the last one. Family Group's bill was printed. She folded it into its folder and carried it across to the corner table. The grandmother of the group thanked her warmly and pressed the folder into the hands of the man beside her, who was apparently paying tonight whether he liked it or not. Maya smiled and said she would be right back. She walked toward the station. She allowed herself one glance at table 14. Victor had the bill folder open in his hands. He was looking at something inside it. His face had not moved. That was the thing she noticed first, because it was the most important thing. There had been no change in his expression. No small raising of the eyebrows, no flicker of confusion, no pause that was too long or too short. He was looking at whatever he was looking at, with the same composed, still face that he had carried since he walked through the door. Crane was speaking. Victor was nodding at whatever Crane was saying, and his eyes were on the open folder in his hands, and then they were back on Crane, and then they were briefly somewhere else, looking down, or sideways, at something that was not the table. Maya looked away. She picked up the tray and went back to the kitchen pass-through for the dessert plates from table 3. Her heart was doing something she could feel in her chest and in the sides of her throat. She told it to stop, which did not work, but which she felt better for attempting. She plated the desserts with care, wiped the rims, set them on the tray with steady hands, and carried them out. She was going back past the bar. She did not look directly at the two men, but she was aware of them in the peripheral way she had been aware of them all evening. The older man with the broad shoulders was still in his seat. His drink had not moved significantly in the last 15 minutes. The younger man was still looking at his phone, resting face down on the bar. Neither of them had moved. Nothing had changed. And yet something in the room had changed, because Victor Harlow had read what was on the back of a receipt, and Maya could not know what he had done with that information, but the fact that the room had not erupted into anything suggested that he had done something with it very quietly. She served the desserts. She checked back in with the anniversary couple. She stood at the station and refilled the water pitcher and set it back in its place. And then she looked at table 14 again and felt the air go out of her lungs. Crane had the manila folder pushed fully across the table now. It was open in front of Victor. A document was visible inside it, dense with text and professional in its presentation. The kind of document that was prepared by people whose job it was to make large financial agreements look smooth and inevitable. Victor had a pen in his hand. She had not seen him pick it up. He was turning it between his fingers, slowly, the way a person turns a pen when they are considering something. Crane was speaking steadily, and with the confidence of a man on the final step of a long climb. Maya's hand found the edge of the station. She pressed her fingers against it. She had written 3 lines on the back of a receipt and put them in a folder in front of a man she did not know, a man who was either about to sign a document that would ruin him or who had already decided that he was not going to, and she could not tell which of those things was true, because his face was showing nothing, absolutely nothing, at all. The pen moved in his fingers. He set it flat on the table, parallel to the folder's edge. He said something to Crane. Crane's smile tightened by the smallest fraction. Victor reached for his wine glass. He lifted it, tilted it slightly as if appreciating the color, and turned it in the light. Maya watched. And in the curved surface of the wine glass, angled just so, the reflection of the room moved and shifted, and for 1/2 second, she saw what the glass was showing. A small, compressed image of the bar at the far end of the room. The two men at the right end of it, their stillness, their placement, their orientation toward table 14. Victor set the glass down. He said something else to Crane, quietly. A question about a detail in the document, she guessed. Something that required an answer, because Crane leaned forward and began to explain something with careful, specific words. Victor listened. He did not pick up the pen. Maya pressed her fingertips harder against the station's edge. She did not yet know whether she had done the right thing, and she did not yet know whether any of it was going to matter. But she watched the man at table 14 hold a conversation about a document he had not yet signed, and she held very still, and she waited. At the bar, the younger man touched his phone. At the bar, the older man, with the broad shoulders, let out a slow breath through his nose and shifted his weight forward in his seat, just slightly, the way a person does when they are moving from waiting to preparing. And Victor Harlow set both hands flat on the table in front of him and looked at the folder as if he were reading it from memory. He already knew what was in it. He was simply not signing it. Not yet. Maybe not at all. Maya released the breath she had been holding for the last 43 seconds and allowed herself one more look at the two men at the bar. They were still watching. They had not understood yet that the thing they were waiting for was not going to happen. But she was beginning to understand something else. That the man at table 14 had read her message, had looked at the room in the reflection of his wine glass, had seen everything she had seen, and had decided, in the exact same calm, collected, unhurried way that he had walked into this restaurant, what he was going to do about it. She picked up her cloth. She went back to work. And she waited. Victor Harlow asked Elliot Crane a question about the third clause of the document. Maya could not hear the words from across the floor, but she could see the quality of the question, the way Crane received it, the brief flicker of recalibration in his expression before the smooth answer came. It was the reaction of a man who had expected to be past this point by now, who had expected to be watching a pen move across a signature line, rather than explaining a clause that should have been settled weeks ago in a legal office. She was at the station, doing what she always did when she needed to stay in one place without it looking strange, organizing the condiment tray, checking the alignment of the water glasses, making small, purposeful adjustments to things that did not need adjusting. She had done this 100 times on difficult evenings, the ones where a table was running late, and the kitchen was ready, and the manager was looking at her with a question in his eyes. She knew how to look busy while being still. But tonight, the stillness was different. Tonight she was still, because the man at table 14 had done something that told her the receipt had been read, and she did not know what came next. Victor had set the pen down. He had asked a question. He was making Crane work for the answer. And the two men at the bar had shifted fractionally in their seats, in the way of people who are approaching the edge of their patience, without yet reaching it. Claire Doyle appeared at the station, from the direction of the kitchen, carrying a dessert tray for her own section. She paused next to Maya for a half-second, long enough to say quietly, without looking directly at her, "You all right? You look like you're somewhere else entirely." "I'm fine," Maya said. "Table 3 asked for the bill twice. I was just trying to remember if I already took it." "You did," Claire said. 15 minutes ago." She moved away toward her section, and the brief, ordinary exchange settled something in Maya's chest. The world was still doing what it did. Tables were turning. Desserts were going out. The anniversary couple were asking about after-dinner drinks. Everything around her was proceeding normally. Only table 14 was not. She watched Victor nod at whatever Crane had said. He picked up the folder and turned one of the pages inside it with his finger, studying something. Crane watched him. The associates at the table were quiet. There was a stillness at table 14 that was, from a distance, indistinguishable from the stillness of any business dinner where numbers were being discussed and careful minds were doing their work. But Maya had been watching that table for the better part of 2 hours, and she could see the difference. The stillness tonight had a different quality. It was the stillness of controlled tension, of men who were keeping things inside, that wanted to move outward. Victor's left hand moved below the edge of the table. She saw it go down and stay there, resting against his thigh, or against the arm of the chair. His right hand remained on the table, turning the folder's page. His face remained in conversation with Crane, but the left hand had gone somewhere she could not see, and it had gone there, with the same deliberate calm with which he did everything else. She had noticed, when he arrived, that he wore a watch on his left wrist. It was not a large or expensive-looking one, not the kind of watch that gets mentioned in profiles, or worn for the effect it has in rooms like this. It was a sturdy, plain thing with a dark face, the kind of watch that is chosen for function over appearance. She could not see his left hand. She did not know what he was doing with it, but she had spent the last hour watching a man who had trained himself not to give anything away, and something about the way that left hand had moved below the table felt, even from this distance, like a decision being made. She turned away from the table and went to top up the water at the anniversary table. The husband, his name was Peter, she had learned, because he and his wife used each other's names a great deal the way comfortable people do, looked up and thanked her. His wife, whose name was Diane, was telling a story about something that had happened at their wedding that Peter had misremembered, and Peter was laughing at his own version of events. They were entirely inside their own world tonight, which was exactly what an anniversary dinner should be, and Maya was glad for them, in a distant, automatic way that required nothing of her attention. She refilled the water and moved back. From the corner of her eye, table 14. Victor had closed the folder. He had not signed anything. The folder was closed, and it lay on the tablecloth between him and Crane in the way of something that has been set aside. Not finished with, just moved. Crane's hands were on the table, both of them, in the careful, managed way of a man keeping himself from reaching out to move the folder back. Victor said something. He glanced at his watch. He put his hand in his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He looked at it briefly, the way a person looks at something that has just arrived. He did something with his thumb. Then he set the phone face down on the table beside his plate, and he picked up his wine glass and leaned back slightly in his chair, and said something to one of his associates, with an easy, relaxed expression. The associate said something back. Victor responded with a small, natural-sounding laugh. Crane watched this exchange and added something himself, joining the conversation, and the table became for a moment a perfectly ordinary business dinner where people were enjoying the end of a meal. Maya looked at the phone lying face down beside Victor's plate. She looked at his left hand, which had come back up from beneath the table, and was now wrapped around the stem of his wine glass. She had no way of knowing what he had done with that phone. She had no way of knowing what the watch had to do with anything, or whether it had anything to do with anything at all. She was working entirely on observation and instinct, and the things her father had taught her, without knowing he was teaching them. But she had a feeling, a specific, quiet, clear feeling, that something had just happened at table 14 that was not visible to anyone else in the room. She went to the station and checked the water pitcher. It was full. She checked it again. It was still full. Her mind was doing two things at once. The professional part of it was tracking the room. Table 2 needed their dessert ordered. The family in the corner had received their bill and were working through the math. The bar order for a couple at table 6 needed following up. All of this was running in one part of her mind, with the familiar efficiency of 3 years at this job. The other part of her mind was entirely at table 14. Victor stood up. He did it calmly and without hurry, the way he had done everything. He set his napkin on the table with a single, neat fold. He said something to Crane, something short, conversational in its tone, and to his associates, who both gave small acknowledgments. He took his phone from the table and put it in his jacket pocket. He touched the back of his chair with one hand as he moved away from the table. "Excuse me a moment," she heard him say. She was close enough to catch it this time, because she had been approaching with a water pitcher and had stopped 3 tables away, with no particular excuse for being there. He walked toward the back of the room, in the direction of the corridor that led to the restrooms and the kitchen service entrance. She watched him go. Crane watched him go. At the bar, the older man's head turned. She kept moving, went to table 6 with the water pitcher, refilled glasses for the couple there, smiled, confirmed that everything was fine, moved back. One of Victor's associates said something to the other, and the other gave a very natural, very easy nod, and then excused himself as well. Toward the exit, Maya realized, taking a route that passed through the bar area, pausing at the bar for just long enough to appear to be glancing at the drinks menu, then continuing toward the restaurant's main entrance, as if he had decided to step outside for some air. He walked out. Crane had not noticed. He was looking at the folder on the table. He had picked it up and was reviewing it with the expression of someone who was going over familiar material to confirm that it was still what he remembered. The second associate said something to Crane, a quiet word, a reasonable-sounding excuse that Maya could not hear, and then he too left the table, moving in the direction of the service corridor. 3 minutes. Victor had left the table 3 minutes ago. Both of his associates had followed, 2 minutes apart, by 2 different routes. Crane was still at table 14, with an unsigned folder in front of him, and a half-full wine glass, and the expression of a man who had not quite finished the calculation. Maya was behind the station, not polishing anything, not adjusting anything, just standing there with her hands flat on the counter and watching table 14. And then Crane checked his watch. He put the folder down. He looked toward the back of the room, toward the corridor, and the expression on his face changed. It was not a large change. It was the kind of change that moves through a face quickly, the way a shadow moves across a wall when a cloud passes over the sun. But it was there, a tightening, a recalculation, the specific look of a man who has just understood that something he was counting on has shifted. He reached inside his jacket with 2 fingers. He checked his phone. His face did not move again after that. It was very still, very controlled. But the stillness now was not the same as the stillness of a business dinner. It was the stillness of something held under pressure. At the bar, the older man stood up. He stood up without a word to the younger man, without looking at his drink, without any of the natural finishing movements of a person who has just decided to leave a bar. He simply stood up and turned toward the dining floor. Maya's hands pressed flat on the counter. The older man looked at table 14. He looked at Crane, and Crane looked back at him with the smallest, tightest shake of his head that she had ever seen. The older man's jaw moved. Then, from the direction of the restaurant's entrance, the first thing came through the door that had nothing to do with dinner reservations. She heard it before she saw it, a change in the sound of the entrance hallway, the way a room's acoustics shift when more bodies enter a space quickly. George Palmer's voice, higher than usual, saying something she could not make out. And then 2 figures in plain clothes moving through the entrance with the particular kind of intention that does not belong in a restaurant. And then 3 more behind them. And then the older man at the bar made a move toward the exit and stopped, because there were 2 more figures already at the exit. And Elliot Crane, at table 14, sat very still in his chair, with his hands on the tablecloth and the unsigned folder in front of him, and his face was completely empty now, the way a face looks when every calculation it was running has been interrupted all at once. Victor Harlow was not in the room. He had been gone for 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes, something that had been planned over many careful months had come entirely undone in the space of time it takes to walk through a kitchen, step into a waiting car, and disappear into a Friday evening. Maya stood at the server station. Her hands were still flat on the counter. The room was very loud now, and very still, in the particular combination that happens when ordinary people in an ordinary space understand all at once that something extraordinary has just entered it. She breathed in through her nose. She breathed out. She thought of her father. She thought of 3 lines on the back of a receipt, circled in red, delivered to a table 14 feet away. She thought about how everything in a room tells you something, if you are paying attention. She had been paying attention, and now she stood at the station and watched the room change, and she kept both hands flat on the counter, and she was very, very still. Victor Harlow had read the message at 9:14 in the evening. He knew the exact time because he had a habit, developed over many years and for specific reasons, of tracking time in fine intervals, not with anxiety, but with the practiced awareness of someone for whom the difference between 9:14 and 9:16 had once been the difference between the right decision and the wrong one. Old habits, once built properly, do not leave. They become part of the way a person inhabits a room. The bill folder had been placed in front of him by the waitress, who had been watching the room for the last 2 hours, with a precision that he had noticed within the first 15 minutes of the evening. He had noticed it the way he noticed everything, without appearing to notice it, without it interrupting the surface of his conversation with Elliot Crane. He had simply registered it, filed it, and continued. A waitress who polished clean glasses and watched the floor with soft, patient eyes. It was the kind of watching that was trained, not anxious. There was a difference, and he knew it well. He had opened the folder under the cover of a standard bill review. The card was there, the total was there, and on the back of the receipt, in clear, steady handwriting in red ink, 3 lines, each one circled. Enemy behind you. Deal gone wrong. Exit now. He read them twice. Then he looked up at Crane, who was mid-sentence about a subsidiary asset. He said something back, something that was heard as agreement and was in fact a filler of words, designed to hold a conversation in place, while his mind did something else entirely. He had spent 11 years, from the age of 26 to 37, in a division of federal intelligence that no longer existed under its original name. He had worked under 2 different identities in 4 countries, had negotiated things in rooms where the consequences of getting the tone wrong were very final, and had eventually left that world for the world of finance, because he had found, to his own surprise, that the skills transferred more directly than most people would imagine. The reading of rooms, the identification of risk, the construction of a plan under time pressure that could not look like a plan to anyone who was watching. Crane was watching. He looked at the wine glass in front of him. He reached for it and tilted it slightly in the light, the way a person does when they are admiring the color of a good wine. In the curved lower surface of the glass, the room behind him compressed and rearranged itself into a small, distorted panorama. He found the bar. He found the two men at the far right end of it. He found their posture, their stillness, their orientation. He set the glass down. He said to Crane, "This is an excellent Burgundy. Did you choose this, or did the house suggest it?" Crane said that he had chosen it himself. Victor said that the choice was a good one, and he meant it, and he picked up the pen beside the folder and turned it in his fingers. He did not pick up the pen to sign. He picked up the pen to give his hands something to do that looked like the natural extension of reviewing a document, while his mind assembled a picture of the room that was now very different from the one he had assembled when he arrived. He had arrived tonight knowing that Crane had been behaving differently in the last 3 months. Not dramatically. Elliot Crane was not a man who did anything dramatically. He was a man of careful increments, which was why he had been an excellent partner for so many years, and why whatever he had been doing for the last 3 months had been so difficult to trace directly. There had been small things, a delay in confirming a wire, a meeting that Crane had taken without noting it on the shared calendar, a phone call overheard in a corridor that Crane had ended when he became aware that Victor was nearby. None of these things alone was definitive. Together, they had brought Victor to a level of awareness that he had been carrying quietly for 6 weeks. He had said nothing. He had waited. He had agreed to this dinner, to the signing of this transfer document, because he had wanted to see what Crane was actually planning, rather than guess at it from incomplete information. Now, courtesy of a waitress with a red pen and a very particular way of watching a room, he knew. He set the pen down, parallel to the folder's edge. He asked Crane about the third clause of the document, not because he had not read it, but because the third clause gave him something to talk about while his left hand went below the table. He wore a watch on his left wrist. It was an unremarkable watch to anyone who did not know what it was. Frank Lawson had given it to him 18 months ago with a specific demonstration of what the 2 small buttons on the left side of the case could do. Frank was Victor's head of security, a former military man himself, 22 years in a branch of the armed forces that had taught him the same broad category of skills that Victor had learned through other routes. They worked well together, precisely because they shared a language that had no real vocabulary, a language of recognition, of understood signals, of knowing what a situation required without needing it spelled out. Victor pressed the left button of his watch twice. He brought his hand back up to the table. 2 taps was the signal they had established 8 months ago in the context of a separate situation that had since resolved, but the signal was still current, still active, still understood. 2 taps meant, activate. Come to the service entrance. Bring the car around from the east side. Frank would have his phone on him. Frank always had his phone on him, and he was parked on the street outside the Meridian in the second of 3 vehicles, which was where he always was when Victor was inside a location. Victor looked at his phone as if a message had come in that was mildly interesting. He set it face down. He gave himself 30 seconds to reassemble the surface of the evening, the dinner, the conversation, the mood of the table, and then he said to Marcus, the associate on his right, very quietly, and with the ease of a man mentioning something trivial, 2 minutes. Marcus heard him. Marcus said, without changing his expression, "Of course." And then he said something to Crane that was conversational and required a response, and Crane gave the response. And in the small window of that exchange, Marcus caught the eye of Daniel, the second associate, and the signal between them was the smallest possible thing. A shift in the angle of a chin, downward and to the left, and Daniel straightened in his chair, in the way a person does when they are about to excuse themselves. Victor talked to Crane about the document. He asked specific questions that required specific answers, and Crane gave them with the practiced smoothness of someone who had prepared for exactly this, who had anticipated every objection and counter and question, and had his answers ready. Victor listened and nodded, and said things that kept the conversation moving forward, and the whole time, the second hand was moving around the face of his watch, and Frank Lawson was pulling the car from its parking position on the east side of the building and bringing it around to the service entrance. Daniel left the table first. He did it naturally, excusing himself with a plausible reason, moving in the direction of the bar area with the ease of someone who wanted to step away from a business dinner for a moment. He passed through the bar, paused at the counter, glanced at the drinks menu, and continued to the main exit. He was outside in under 40 seconds. Victor asked Crane another question. Crane answered it. The folder was still on the table between them. Victor had not touched it since he set the pen down. Marcus left the table 2 minutes after Daniel. He went in a different direction, toward the service corridor, with the simple explanation that he was looking for the restroom. He said it quietly to Victor rather than to Crane, which was normal enough. He did not return. And then Victor folded the napkin from his lap and set it on the table, and he stood up, and he said to Elliot Crane, "Excuse me just a moment." Crane looked at him with a smile that was working very hard at being a relaxed smile. "Of course," Crane said. "Take your time." Victor walked across the dining room. He did not look at the bar. He did not look at the waitress at the server station, though he was aware of her, the way he had been aware of her all evening. A presence in the room that was paying very close attention to the right things. He walked with the unhurried, natural pace of a man stepping away from a dinner table for a moment, which was exactly what he looked like, and he moved down the corridor to the right of the restrooms without pausing. The kitchen was through the swing door at the end of the corridor. He pushed it open. The kitchen of the Meridian, at 9:17 on a Friday evening, was fully operational, which meant it was warm and busy and full of motion. Cooks at their stations, the rush of a service in its later stages, the smell of the final dessert preparations. It also meant that no one immediately paid strong attention to a tall man in a well-fitted jacket who walked through the swing door and across the kitchen, toward the service exit, with the bearing of someone who knew where he was going. The service exit was a heavy door with a push bar. He went through it without stopping. Frank Lawson was standing beside the car on the other side, exactly where he was supposed to be. "Sir," Frank said. That was all. It was all that was needed. Victor got in. Frank was behind the wheel before the door closed. The car moved. Victor looked at his watch. 9:18. He looked out through the window as they turned into the street, and he thought about a waitress with a red pen and 3 lines on the back of a receipt, and he thought about the fact that whatever she had seen it alone, had thought through it alone, and had acted on it with a clarity and a steadiness that he had not encountered many times in his life, outside of very specific and very structured environments. He also thought about Elliot Crane sitting at a table with an unsigned folder in front of him, about a plan that had taken months to construct and had been dismantled in the time it takes to walk from a table to a service door. About the 2 men at the end of the bar who were now sitting in a room where the person they had been watching was no longer present. He would find out soon enough what happened in the room after he left. He already knew what had not happened in the room. His name had not gone on that document. That was all that needed to be true for tonight. The rest was the work of other people whose job it was to close these kinds of situations down, and Frank had already, in the 40 seconds between the 2 watch taps and the car starting, made a call that had set that process in motion. Victor leaned his head back against the seat. He closed his eyes for a moment. He was thinking about 3 lines of handwriting, circled in red, on the back of a restaurant receipt. He was thinking about the 1 second of eye contact that had accompanied the delivery of that folder. The way the waitress had held it for exactly the right length, long enough to be deliberate, brief enough to be invisible to everyone else at the table. He thought about what kind of person understood instinctively how to be precise about something like that. He opened his eyes. "Frank," he said. "Yes, sir." "Find out who she is." Frank said nothing. He did not need to say anything. He reached one hand into his jacket pocket, and the phone was already in it. Victor looked out the window again. The city moved past. 9:19 in the evening. Somewhere behind him, a restaurant was changing from a place where a quiet Friday dinner was ending to something considerably less quiet. He did not go back to find out. He did not need to. He already knew how it ended. The moment Crane understood that Victor was not coming back, the temperature of the room changed. Maya felt it before she could name it. She was at the station, filling a water pitcher, and she looked up at table 14, and saw Elliot Crane looking at his phone, with a face that was very controlled and very wrong. He had been sitting there alone for 6 minutes, and the aloneness had shifted over the course of those 6 minutes, from a man waiting for a business partner to return from a phone call, to something that looked like a man doing arithmetic and not liking the result. At the bar, the older man was standing. He had not finished his drink. He had not asked for the bill. He had simply stopped pretending that he was at the bar for a drink and stood up, because the reason for being at the bar was now 6 minutes gone and the waiting was over. The younger man at the bar had not stood up yet. He was still on his stool, but he was leaning forward slightly, and he had his phone in his hand with the screen facing up. Crane put his own phone in his jacket pocket. He placed both hands flat on the table. He looked across the dining room toward the back corridor, the one Victor had walked down, and she could see, from 10 feet away, the decision going across his face. Not what to do, but how to do it. The what was already determined. The how was the part that required a final few seconds of consideration. He reached for the folder. He picked it up and put it back in his briefcase, smoothly and without hurry, the way you tidy away things that are no longer needed. He closed the briefcase's clasps. He picked up the napkin from his lap and set it on the table. He looked at the unfinished wine in his glass. He did not drink it. He stood up. The older man at the bar began to move toward the dining room entrance, and then the door opened. Not the main entrance. The side corridor door that connected to the building's internal hallway from the street. It opened, and 3 people came through it, moving with the specific directional purpose of people who are not arriving for dinner. A woman and 2 men, in plain clothes, with identification already in their hands. The woman said something to George Palmer, who was standing at the entrance. George took 1 step back and pressed himself against the wall with the expression of someone who has just understood that the professional response to this situation is to get out of the way and stay out of the way. The older man at the bar stopped walking. He stopped because 2 other people had just entered through the main door, a man and a woman who had been, until 30 seconds ago, on the street outside, and who were now standing at the entrance with identification in their hands, and with the same directional, deliberate quality as the ones who had come in from the side. The barman looked to his left. He looked to his right. He looked at the older man across the room. The older man had both hands raised to about waist level in a very slight, very still gesture of compliance that was not dramatic but was entirely clear. Maya gripped the edge of the counter. She had expected something to happen, and something was happening, but the scale of it, the number of people, the speed of it, the obvious preparation behind it, was larger than what she had imagined when she had stood at the server station and decided to write 3 lines on a receipt. She had imagined a simpler version. She had imagined Victor leaving and perhaps coming back with someone, or making a call, and the situation resolving in some contained, local way. She had not imagined this many people coming through this many doors with this much coordination. But here they were. The restaurant had gone very quiet, not entirely silent. There was still the sound of the kitchen, the distant sound of the street outside, the clink of a glass set down at table 6 by someone whose hand had moved purely on reflex. But the conversation that had been filling the room at a steady, warm level was entirely gone. Every table had stopped talking. Every person was looking at the entrance, or at the bar, or at the plainclothes individuals moving through the room. Claire appeared at Maya's elbow. "What is happening?" Claire said. It was not quite a question. "I don't know exactly," Maya said, which was true, in the sense that she did not know the specific terms, or the official nature of what was unfolding, but was not true in the other, more fundamental sense. "Should I?" Claire began. "Keep the tables calm," Maya said. "Tell them everything is being handled. Keep the water topped up. If anyone wants to leave, tell them to speak to George." Claire looked at her for 1 long beat. "You knew something was wrong tonight," Claire said. Maya said nothing. Claire looked at the entrance, where Elliot Crane was now being spoken to by the woman who had come in through the side door, and where Crane's briefcase was on the table, and his face was the face of a man who had stopped running all calculations because the ground had been removed from beneath them. "All right," Claire said, and she went back to her tables. The plainclothes agents, that was what Maya had settled on calling them in her mind, because whatever the formal designation was, the training and the purpose were clear. Moved through the restaurant with the efficiency of people who had been briefed on the layout. Two of them stayed near the exits. One went to Crane's table. The other two, the older man and the younger man at the bar, were being spoken to by separate agents at separate ends of the bar area. No one was raising their voice. No one was making a scene in the dramatic sense. But the room was entirely, unmistakably changed. The ordinary Friday evening at the Meridian had stopped being an ordinary Friday evening, and the 40-some guests currently sitting at its tables were all making the same quiet decision. Stay calm. Do not move. Watch and wait. George Palmer moved along the room toward Maya, with the expression of a man who needed something to anchor himself to. He reached the station and put his hands on the counter. "What is happening?" he said, and unlike Claire's version of this question, his was very much a question. "I think someone at table 14 tonight was not who they said they were," Maya said. George looked at her. "The man who was supposed to sign a document at that table," he said. "The man at that table didn't sign anything," Maya said. George looked at the table, where the briefcase was being examined by a plainclothes agent, and where Crane was watching the process with his hands folded in his lap. "No," George said, mostly to himself. "No, I suppose he didn't." He straightened up, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the entrance with the bearing of a man who had decided that the professional response was to be available, composed, and as helpful as possible to whatever was now happening in his restaurant. Maya watched him go. She appreciated that about George. He was not the kind of person who came apart under surprise. He simply adjusted. The agent who came to find Maya was a man of perhaps 40, with a medium build and an unremarkable face, and light brown hair that had been cut with the same low-attention approach he had apparently applied to his general appearance for most of his life. He introduced himself as Daniel Carter, and showed her an identification that she looked at carefully, because her father had always said that you should look at identification carefully, not as a formality, but as a practice, because a person who offers real identification moves differently than a person who is hoping you will not look too hard. She looked. It was real. "You're the server assigned to table 14 this evening?" he said. "Yes." "Can we speak somewhere quiet?" She looked around the restaurant. The guests were still in their seats. The kitchen was still running. She could hear it. The agents at the bar were concluding their work. 3 of the 5 people who had entered the restaurant were now in the bar area, and 2 were at table 14. "The back room," she said. "The staff room." "Through the kitchen." He nodded. She took off her apron and folded it over the counter, and told Claire with her eyes that she was going, and that the station was Claire's, and Claire nodded, with the kind of absolute composure that Maya had always admired. The staff room was small and plain: a table, 4 chairs, a coat rack along one wall, a coffee maker that ran through the whole service. Maya sat down on one side of the table, and Agent Carter sat down on the other side, and opened a notebook. There was another man with him, younger, who he introduced as Agent Barrow. "Tell me about tonight," Carter said. She told him. She was thorough, and she was precise, because her father had taught her to be both, when giving an account of something observed. She described the arrival of Crane, then Victor. She described the table dynamic, what she had noticed about Crane's posture and expression. She described the 2 men at the bar, and what she had observed about them, including the weight distribution in the older man's jacket. She described the folder. She described the exchange of signals between the barman and Crane. She described the name she had heard. Carter's pen stopped. He looked at her. "Romano," he said. "Yes." Carter and Barrow exchanged a look that she could not read exactly, but which had the quality of something that had been anticipated. "You heard the name clearly?" Carter said. "Yes. I was close to the table. Crane said it while I was adjusting the empty table beside them." She paused. He said, "The Romano arrangement holds." Carter wrote this down. "And then you wrote on the receipt," he said. "Yes. Do you have a copy of what you wrote?" She reached into the pocket of the apron she had folded over her arm and produced the small pad she used to write table orders and notes, where she always wrote the key items of each table's order as a backup in case the electronic system had an issue. There, in her own handwriting in pencil, were the words from table 14's receipt, written as a reminder to herself before she had written them in pen on the paper. She slid the pad across the table to Carter. He read it. He set it down carefully, as if it were something that had more weight than its size suggested. "Ms. Collins," he said, "how much do you know about Leonard Romano?" She told him what she knew. Her father. The gray metal box. The name in his files. The case that had gone nowhere. Carter was very still while she spoke. When she finished, he looked at Agent Barrow again. Then he looked back at her. "Your father was Owen Collins," he said. Not a question. "Yes." He closed the notebook. "I'll need you to stay for a while tonight," he said. "We have some things to go through with you. Is that all right?" She said yes. He stood up, and Barrow stood with him, and Carter paused at the door. "You did something tonight," he said, "that took a great deal of clarity." She looked at him. "My father was a detective," she said. "He taught me to pay attention." Carter nodded once, and went back out through the kitchen, and she heard the swing door close behind him. She sat alone in the small staff room with the coffee maker running its steady cycle beside her, and she put her folded apron on the table in front of her, and she pressed her hands together in her lap. Outside, in the restaurant, the Friday evening was ending in a way that no Friday evening at the Meridian had ever ended before. She thought about the 3 circled lines on a receipt that had started all of it. She thought about how ordinary the moment of writing them had felt, and how it felt now, sitting in the small staff room with the weight of the night settling around her. She sat with it. She breathed. She waited. Agent Carter came back to the staff room 40 minutes later with a paper cup of coffee that had come from somewhere that was not the Meridian's kitchen, because the Meridian's kitchen had closed for the evening, and it was past 11. He set the cup in front of her and sat down across the table with his notebook open and a second person beside him, not Barrow this time, but a woman he introduced as Agent Nora Gill, who was precise and composed, and who set a small recording device in the center of the table before saying a word. "We're going to record this portion of the conversation," Gill said. "Is that all right with you?" "Yes," Maya said. She had been sitting in the staff room for the better part of an hour. She had heard the restaurant through the wall, not clearly, but enough. The voices, the movement, the gradual quieting of it as the evening came to its unusual close. George had come to check on her once, 20 minutes in, putting his head through the kitchen door with a look on his face that asked if she was all right. She had told him she was fine. He had said the last of the guests had been allowed to leave, and the restaurant was being held for the purposes of the investigation. She had thanked him, and he had looked at her for a moment, with an expression she could not fully read, and then disappeared back into the kitchen. Now Carter opened his notebook to a new page, and Gill pressed the button on the recording device, and said the date, the time, the location, and the names of the people present. "Ms. Collins," Carter began, "I want to walk back through the evening from the beginning. I know we covered some of this before, but this time, I'm going to ask you to be as specific as possible about timing. Not because I doubt anything you said earlier, but because the timeline of this evening is going to matter significantly. Do you understand?" "Yes," she said. "Good. When did you first become aware that the 2 individuals at the bar were not ordinary customers?" She thought about this carefully before answering. "I noticed them when I first came on shift," she said. "At around 6 o'clock. They were already at the bar. I registered them as customers and moved on. But around 8:30, when table 14 had been seated for about 20 minutes, I started watching them with more attention." "What drew your attention back to them?" "Their posture. The way they were sitting relative to the room. They were oriented toward the dining floor, not toward the bar, not toward each other, toward the tables, and specifically toward table 14. "Could you be more specific about the posture of the older individual?" "He was upright. Very upright, for someone at a bar with a drink in front of him. He held his shoulders in a specific way. And his jacket." She paused, because she wanted to describe this exactly right. The left side of his jacket fell differently than the right. There was a weight distribution that was uneven. The left side sat heavier. Carter made a note. "My father carried his service weapon under his left arm for 22 years, Maya said. "I recognized the way the fabric fell." Gill looked at her. "You identified a concealed item from a distance of approximately how many feet?" Gill said, "From where I was standing to the bar, about 20 feet. "In a room with this lighting level?" Gill said, glancing up at the amber overhead light. "Yes." Another note. Carter clicked his pen twice. "And the folder at table 14, Carter said. "Tell me about the document you saw inside it." She described what she had been able to observe of the document from her position, the format, the density of text, the professional presentation of something contractual in nature. She described the way Crane had placed it on the table, and the way he had pushed it toward Victor. "The name Romano," Carter said. "Tell me again exactly what you heard and when." She told him. The exact words, the exact moment, the distance between herself and the table. Carter and Gil exchanged the same look they had exchanged before when the name was said, and she filed this away. "Agent Carter," she said, "I think there are things about Leonard Romano that you know and that I don't. I'm not asking you to tell me anything that is confidential, but my father had a case file on Romano. I read that file, some years ago, and the case was closed without conclusion. If there is something about tonight that connects to my father's work on that case, I think I would like to know." Carter was quiet for a moment. Gil looked at him. He said, "What I can tell you is that Leonard Romano has been under federal investigation for the past 4 years. Not for the first time. Earlier investigations, including those at the local level, were closed for reasons that had nothing to do with a lack of evidence. There were procedural complications on at least 2 occasions." He stopped. He seemed to be choosing the next words carefully. "One of those investigations," he said, "was conducted out of the city's 4th District Detective Division, approximately 15 years ago." Maya looked at him steadily. "My father," she said. Carter said nothing. Which was, she understood, its own kind of answer. She sat with this for a moment. 15 years ago her father had been in his late 30s, mid-career, working cases with the precision and patience that had defined his 22 years on the job. She had read his Romano notes as a young woman sitting on the floor of the spare room, with the gray metal box open in her lap, and she had thought about how frustrated he must have been, writing those tight, circled sentences that ended in question marks and unresolved leads. The case had simply stopped. A man who worked the gray edges between the legal world and the other one had simply moved on and gone quiet, and the file had ended at the bottom of a page in her father's handwriting, without a final resolution. What she had not known, sitting on that floor with those pages in her hands, was that the case had been closed, not because Romano had been cleared, but because something in the process had been interrupted. She understood this now, from what Carter had not said. Her father had seen Romano. He had built a case, and something had closed it down before it could be finished. And tonight, 15 years later, she had been standing at a server station with a red pen in her hand, and the name had come through the air from table 14, and her brain had matched it to those pages in the gray metal box, and she had written 3 lines on a receipt. She pressed her hands flat on the table in front of her. "Tell me what you need from me," she said. Carter opened the notebook to a new section. "You're going to be a key witness," he said. "Your account of this evening, what you observed, what you heard, when you heard it, and what you did, is going to form a significant part of the foundation for what comes next." "What comes next?" she said. "Romano is being located tonight. Crane is in custody. The 2 individuals from the bar are being processed. What you observed and documented tonight connects directly to a conspiracy that has been in preparation for 8 months." He paused. "You did not just help Victor Harlow leave a dinner. You gave us the timing and the confirmation we needed to move at exactly the right moment." She looked at him. "I thought I was just writing a note," she said. Carter almost smiled. It was a very small thing, barely visible, but it was there. "You were," he said. "That's exactly what you were doing." Gil pressed the stop button on the recorder and looked at Maya. "We'll need you to come in formally," Gil said. "Not tonight. This week, when you're ready. We'll give you 2 days. You'll make a formal statement, properly recorded. You may be called to testify at a later date." "I understand," Maya said. She thought about her criminal justice degree. She thought about the 3 credits she had left. She thought about the semester when she had taken evidence and procedure as her most recent course and had sat in a classroom writing notes about the documentation of witness accounts and the criteria for admissible testimony. Life had a particular sense of humor, she decided. Carter stood up, and Gil stood with him. "One more thing," Carter said. He was at the door. "The account you gave us of your reasoning tonight, the way you processed what you observed, the way you constructed your understanding of the situation, the decision you made about how to act and why, that is not a common quality. I want you to know that." She looked at him. "My father was a detective," she said again. "I know," Carter said, and the way he said it made her think that he did know. that the name Owen Collins was known to him in a context that went beyond her having mentioned it tonight. He went through the kitchen door. She sat alone in the staff room for another few minutes. She could hear George moving around in the restaurant, the sound of chairs being stacked. The coffee maker had stopped, and the small room was quieter than it had been all evening. She thought about her father's gray metal box. She thought about the name Romano in his files, in his careful, tight handwriting, with the hard question marks. She thought about tonight. She thought that her father had started something 15 years ago that the system had not let him finish, and that tonight, through a series of unremarkable moments, a Friday shift, a bill folder, a red pen, a thread that had started with him, had finally reached somewhere. She did not know if he would have said this was justice. He had been a careful man about words like that. He would have said it was evidence. He would have said it was process. He would have said that the system worked when the people inside it paid attention. She put on her apron. She went back out into the restaurant. George looked at her from across the floor. "Can I do anything?" he said. "Is there anything left to be done out here tonight?" She said. He looked around the empty restaurant. The tables were mostly clear. The lights were at their lowest setting, the way they went when the evening was over. "Not really," he said. "Then I'm going to go home," she said. He nodded. She collected her bag from the hook in the staff room, put on her coat, and walked through the restaurant to the exit. She paused at the entrance for a moment and looked back at table 14. The white tablecloth was still on it. The wine glass was still there, half full, catching the low light. The napkin that had been folded in Victor's lap was on the table in its neat single fold. The manila folder was gone. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she walked out into the Friday night air. It was cold and clear, and the city was doing what cities do at 11:30 on a Friday, carrying on. She walked to her car. She drove home. She did not turn on the radio. She parked in the lot of her building and turned off the engine and sat in the car for a while in the dark. She thought about the evening, not in the way of replaying it looking for what she might have done differently, because she did not think she had done anything differently than she would do again. She thought about it the way you hold something carefully, because it is both heavy and important, and you want to hold it right. She thought about her father. She thought about 3 lines, and a red pen, and 1 second of eye contact. Then she got out of the car, and she went upstairs, and she put the kettle on, and she found the small notebook from her drawer, the one in her father's handwriting, the personal one, and she sat at the kitchen table with it open in front of her, and she read. She read for a long time. Then the kettle boiled, and she made tea, and she sat there in the quiet of her apartment, and she let the night settle into the place where things go when they are over, and will not leave you easily. She was there for a long time. Then she went to bed. She went back to work on Saturday. This was not because she had recovered, or because the night before had settled into something she understood fully, or because she felt entirely like herself. She went back to work because her Saturday shift started at 5 o'clock, and she had worked every Saturday for 3 years, and the rhythm of the thing was one of the only pieces of the world that felt manageable on a morning when she had slept very little and had spent most of the dark hours sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water and her father's old notebook open in front of her. The notebook was not the gray metal box. It was a different thing, a personal one, lined and small, that he had carried in his chest pocket for years. She had found it in the drawer of the bedside table when she helped her mother Sandra clear out the house the year after he died. She had taken it without saying anything to Sandra, not because she was hiding it, but because it was clearly his, and clearly personal. The handwriting in it was softer than his case notes, less tight, more looping, and she had put it in her own drawer, and taken it from one apartment to the next over the years, and had never read all of it, but had read parts of it on nights when she needed to sit with something of his. She read more of it on Friday night. He had written, in one entry that she kept returning to, "The thing about this work that people from outside it do not understand is that the hard part is not finding things out. The hard part is holding what you find out, without letting it change you in ways that make you less useful. You have to stay clear. A clear head is the only tool that works in every situation." She had read that in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, and she had thought about table 14, about the way her hands had stayed steady while writing 3 lines on a receipt, and she thought that whatever she had inherited from him, it had included this. The ability to stay clear when something was moving fast around her. The ability to act without the fear using up the available space in her mind. She drove to work on Saturday afternoon, under a flat, gray sky, and parked in the back lot, and put on her apron, and clipped her red pen in the front pocket, and went out onto the floor. Claire was already there. Claire looked at her once, carefully, and said, "How are you?" "Fine," Maya said. Claire did not press it. She refilled her water glass, and went to her section. This was one of the things about Claire that Maya valued most. The understanding that sometimes the most useful thing another person can do is leave you to the work. The Saturday evening was not as full as Friday. It never was. The tables were quieter, a little more leisurely in their pace, the way Saturday dinner at a restaurant tends to be. Less about the deal, less about the event, more about the pleasure of the thing itself. Maya worked her tables, and did her job, and kept her mind in the room. She did not think about table 14 for most of the shift. She thought about it at 8:45, when George Palmer stopped her at the station and said quietly, "The news about Harlow Capital is everywhere today." She said nothing. "Crane's arrest," he said. "It's on the business channels, the news sites. They're calling it a major financial conspiracy." He paused. "The restaurant is not mentioned by name." She nodded. "The federal people were here this morning," he said. "They took some things, security footage primarily. I cooperated fully." "I know you would," she said. George looked at her with the particular expression of a man who wants to say something and has decided against it. "You did something difficult last night," he said instead. She looked at the floor for a moment, then back at him. "I did what I could see," she said. He nodded and moved away. She finished the shift. She drove home. On Sunday she slept late and cleaned her apartment and called her mother Sandra in the early afternoon. Sandra lived 40 minutes outside the city, in the house where Maya had grown up, a house with an apple tree in the back garden that her father had planted from a small sapling the year she was born. Sandra answered on the second ring the way she always did, because she was the kind of person who kept her phone near her and answered it promptly, which Maya had inherited. "How are you, love?" Sandra said. "I'm all right," Maya said. "It's been an interesting week." They talked for half an hour about ordinary things. The apple tree needed trimming. There was a good film that Sandra had watched. The neighbor's new dog was very loud at night. Then Maya said, as carefully as she could manage, "Mum, did Dad ever talk to you about a case involving a man named Romano?" Sandra was quiet for a moment. "That name," she said. "You know it," Maya said. "He said it once," Sandra said. "When he came home late one night, I don't remember exactly when, years ago, he came home late, and he sat at the kitchen table for a long time, and I made him tea, and he said, 'There's a man called Romano, and the case is closed, and it shouldn't be closed, and I'm not allowed to say more than that.'" Sandra paused. He was quiet for a few days after, the way he got when something was frustrating him, at a level he couldn't get out. "Yes," Maya said, "I know that quiet." "Did something happen?" Sandra said. "The case is being reopened," Maya said, in a manner of speaking. Sandra was silent for a long moment. "Your father," she said, and then stopped. "Would have been glad," Maya said. "Yes," Sandra said. "He would have been very glad." They stayed on the phone for a few more minutes without saying much else. Sometimes a phone call is not about the words that are said in it. Sometimes it is about the shared understanding of something that does not need to be spelled out, between two people who both know what they are sitting with. Maya said goodbye and hung up and sat at her kitchen table. She was formally asked to come in on Tuesday. She went. The building where Agent Carter's office was located was a plain, mid-sized building in the center of the city, the kind of building that does not announce itself. She was met at the front by a young man who brought her to a conference room on the third floor where Carter was waiting with Gil and a third person, a senior agent named Hartwell, who had the kind of authority that sits in a room quietly, but is visible in every small decision about how to arrange a chair. They recorded her formal statement. This took 2 hours and 20 minutes, and it went over everything she had observed and heard and done on Friday evening in detail that went well beyond the staff room conversation. They asked her about her training, specifically whether she had any professional background in law enforcement or security. She said no. She had her father and his decades of dinner table instruction, and the gray metal box and a notebook in her drawer. Hartwell made a note of this. At the end of the session, Gill told her what Carter had indicated on Friday. She would be required to testify. The timeline for the formal proceedings was being established. She should be prepared to be called within 6 to 10 weeks. She said she understood. Then Hartwell said, "Ms. Collins, we want you to understand the full scope of what you contributed to on Friday evening." She waited. The Romano operation, Hartwell said, was not a local matter. The network that Leonard Romano ran was responsible for the destabilization of 3 corporate entities over the past 9 years. Each time, the method was the same: identify a high-value target, place a trusted associate in close proximity over a period of years, and then engineer a moment where documents could be signed that would legally shift control of assets under fraudulent circumstances. She was listening very carefully. Elliot Crane was recruited 8 months ago, Hartwell continued. Victor Harlow was Romano's most ambitious target. The document in the folder at Table 14 would have transferred control of a significant portion of Harlow Capital's core assets to a company with no traceable beneficial ownership. Mr. Harlow would have had serious legal complications to follow, because the secondary phase of the plan involved forged communications designed to make the transaction appear to be something other than what it was. Maya looked at the table. The 2 individuals at the bar were there to ensure that the transaction was completed that evening, and that Mr. Harlow did not leave the restaurant before signing. She thought about this for a moment. They were there to ensure he could not leave, she said. "That is our assessment," Hartwell said. She sat with this. The shape of the evening rearranged itself slightly in her mind, in light of this information. What she had thought was a financial scheme with a watching element was something more deliberate than that. The 2 men at the bar had not simply been observers or signal senders. They had been insurance. If Victor had not signed voluntarily, the means for compelling him were in the room. She thought about the red pen in her apron pocket. She thought about what the evening might have been if she had not been watching the room the way her father taught her to watch a room. She looked up at Hartwell. "My father investigated Romano 15 years ago," she said. "The case was closed." "Yes," Hartwell said. He looked at her steadily. "We know. He never got resolution on it," she said. "No," Hartwell said, "he didn't." She thought about the entry in the small notebook she had read at 2 in the morning, the thing about staying clear, about not letting what you find out change you in ways that make you less useful. She thought about her father working that case 15 years ago with the same careful precision he brought to everything, and the case going nowhere, and the gray metal box sitting under the spare bed for years after he died. She thought about Friday evening. He would have liked this, she said. Quietly, not to the room, just to herself. No one answered that, which was the right response. She thanked the agents for their time, collected her coat and bag, and took the elevator down to the street. Outside, the city was the same city it had been before she went in. People going about the middle of a Tuesday morning. Cars and bicycles and the sound of something being delivered 2 storefronts down. She stood on the pavement for a moment and breathed the cold air. Then she walked to her car. Then she drove back to her apartment. She had a shift at the Meridian on Thursday. She had a criminal justice paper due on Friday that she had been working on for 3 weeks, on the topic of witness credibility in complex financial cases. She thought, briefly, that the paper might write itself. She went home and made tea, and sat at the desk and opened the laptop. She had work to do. She did it. The paper on witness credibility took her 4 more days to finish, and she submitted it at 11:45 on the Friday morning, 1/4 of an hour before the deadline. She sat at her desk for a moment after clicking send, and looked at the blinking cursor on the empty document, and thought that, all things considered, the last 2 weeks had provided more contextual material for that paper than 3 semesters of coursework combined. The news had been carrying the story throughout that week. She had read the reports carefully, and with the professional attention she was beginning to understand was a core part of who she was, rather than simply a habit she had learned. The coverage was thorough on the elements that were public. Elliot Crane had been charged with multiple counts of conspiracy and financial fraud. 2 unnamed individuals had been arrested in connection with the same operation. A 3rd man, not yet named in the public reports, was being sought in connection with the broader network that the investigators were dismantling across several locations. Victor Harlow's name appeared in the reports as the intended target of the scheme, described in language that was careful and legal and accurate without being colorful. Harlow Capital had released a brief statement confirming that its chief executive had been the subject of an attempted fraud and expressing confidence in the judicial process. The statement was 4 sentences and said nothing more than those 4 sentences needed to say. Maya's name was not mentioned anywhere. She was aware that this was deliberate, and she was grateful for it. She had not sought any of this, had not thought about it in those terms when she had written 3 lines on a receipt. What she had thought about was table 14, and a man across from another man, with a folder between them, and the name Romano in the air, and the shape of a jacket at the bar. That was all. She had not been thinking about consequences or credit. She had been thinking about what was in front of her. She worked her Thursday shift and her Saturday shift, and the restaurant was what it had always been. A well-run, pleasant room with good food and good lighting and the usual mixture of people on usual occasions. Table 14 was occupied on Thursday by a group of architects celebrating a project completion, and on Saturday by a mother and daughter who were having a birthday dinner. It was just a table. It was always just a table. Claire stopped by the station on Thursday evening and said, "The papers said the intended target was someone important in finance, and that the scheme fell apart the very night it was meant to happen." She paused. "At a restaurant." "I read the same thing," Maya said. Claire looked at her for one long, calm second. "I see," she said. She went back to her section, and neither of them brought it up again. George Palmer called Maya into the office at the end of her Saturday shift, the small office behind the kitchen where he kept the staff schedules and the weekly accounts, and a framed photo of the restaurant on the night it opened, which was 21 years ago. He sat behind the desk, and she sat across from it, and he put his hands flat on the desk in the way he did when he had something to say that he wanted to say precisely. "I want you to know," he said, "that what you did 2 weekends ago was beyond anything I would have had the right to expect from someone working a Friday evening shift. And I want you to know that I am aware of it, even if nothing about it was ever discussed formally here." She looked at him. "Thank you, George," she said. "You are one of the best members of staff this restaurant has ever had," he said. "I want you to know that as well. You've been a good manager to work for," she said. He nodded. That seemed to cover it. She got up, collected her bag, and left. Agent Carter called on the following Monday. She was in her car in the parking lot of the college building, where her evening class met, waiting for the lot to clear enough to pull out. His name came up on her phone, and she sat back in her seat and answered it. "How are you doing?" he said, which surprised her a little, because she had not expected the conversation to open that way. "I'm fine," she said, "working." "Good," he said. He sounded like a person who had been working for many hours and who was calling from an office at the end of a long stretch of them. "I wanted to update you on a couple of things before you read them in the press. Crane has entered a plea. He's cooperating with the investigation." She waited. "And Romano was located and taken into custody this morning," Carter said. "In a city 400 miles from here. He'd been there for approximately 3 weeks. She pressed her hand against the steering wheel. "That's significant," she said. "It is," Carter said. "Your testimony is going to be even more central than we initially indicated. The formal proceedings will begin within the next few weeks. I'll be in touch with a specific date for your testimony as soon as it's confirmed." "All right," she said. There was a pause. "Ms. Collins," Carter said, "the investigative team has been through every element of the Friday evening now. We've reviewed the security footage, we've conducted extensive interviews, we've reviewed the financial documentation, and the timeline is very clear." He paused. "The signing of that document would have taken place before we could have intervened. We had been building this case for months, but the specific moment, the evening, the restaurant, the table, we did not have it until we had it. And we had it because of what you wrote on a receipt." She was quiet. "I want you to understand that," he said. "I understand it," she said. She did. She had been sitting with it for 10 days, and she understood the weight of it more clearly every day. Not in a way that made her feel important. She did not feel important about it. She felt the way she imagined a person feels when they have been given a task at exactly the moment when the task needed doing, and they have simply done it. The task did not belong to her. It had arrived in front of her, and she had met it with what she had, which was a red pen and a lifetime of her father's instruction. She thanked Carter. He told her she would hear from him with the court date. She hung up and sat in the parking lot and looked at the gray evening sky through the windscreen. Leonard Romano was in custody. Elliot Crane had entered a plea. She thought about her father's gray metal box and the tight handwriting, and the question marks drawn so hard they dented the next page. She thought about a case closed without resolution, 15 years ago. She thought about the particular quality of satisfaction that is not triumph or celebration, but something quieter, the sense that something unfinished has reached a point that is, if not its end, then at least the place where the long middle of it starts to resolve. She started the car. She drove home. She ate dinner and washed up and sat at her desk and looked at the next assignment for her criminal justice course, which was on the topic of prosecutorial timelines in organized financial crime. She had 3 weeks to submit it. She opened a new document. She typed the title. She sat for a moment with her fingers on the keyboard, and she thought about the fact that she was sitting here, in this apartment, at this desk, finishing a degree that she had started and started again, across 6 years, and that the last 2 weeks had, in a very specific and entirely unexpected way, made the subject of that degree feel less like an academic interest, and more like something that had always been moving toward her from a direction she had not been watching. She started writing. She wrote for an hour without stopping, and then she got up and made herself a cup of tea, and came back and read what she had written, and it was good. Not just adequate, but genuinely good, clear and specific, and built on observation rather than theory alone. She felt something settle in her chest that she could not entirely name, but that had something to do with the feeling of being in the right place, at the right time, doing the right work. She finished the tea. She went back to the document. She wrote until midnight. Then she saved it and closed the laptop and got up and stood in the middle of her apartment for a moment and looked at the desk, at the lamp still on, at the framed photo of her parents on the bookshelf beside the window, her father in the garden by the apple tree, her mother beside him, both of them squinting a little in the sun and smiling, and she thought, he is in all of this, not as a ghost, not as a weight, as a foundation, the way a good house sits on ground that was prepared before it was built. She turned off the lamp. She went to bed. She slept well for the first time since Friday. In the morning she got up and made coffee, and opened the curtains, and looked at the street below, which was exactly the same street it had always been, the same corner shop, the same cracked paving, the same woman who walked her elderly dog past the building at 8:15 every morning. And she thought, the world is the same world, and I am still in it, and there is work to be done. She poured the coffee. She sat down. She opened the laptop. She went back to work. He came in on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the dinner. The Tuesday afternoon shift at the Meridian was the quietest of the week. Lunch had ended, the kitchen was in its mid-afternoon rest between services, and the dining room held maybe 4 tables at any given time, people who had finished a late meeting and stopped in for something, or who preferred the unhurried ease of a restaurant that was not at full capacity. The light at that time of day was different from the evening light. It came through the street-facing windows in a lower, thinner angle, and it made the room feel wider and less dressed up than it was at night, more like itself. Maya had 2 tables. She had topped up the water at both of them, and was doing what she always did in the quiet of the afternoon shift, keeping the station clean, reviewing the reservation list for the evening, going through the motions of the job with the particular relaxed efficiency of someone who has done a thing so many times that the doing of it does not require attention, which frees the attention for other things. She was thinking about the court date. Carter had called the previous Friday with the confirmed date for her testimony, which was in 4 weeks. She had been told to expect to be on the stand for somewhere between 2 and 4 hours, depending on how the defense exercised its right to cross-examination. She had spent the weekend reading everything she could find about testifying in financial proceedings, and had come away with the feeling that, while the process was not designed to be comfortable, it was also not the ordeal that people who watched legal dramas tended to imagine. She was good at being specific. She was good at being calm. She had observed clearly and remembered clearly, and had documented what she observed at the time of observing it. These were the things that made testimony useful, and she had all of them. She was thinking about this when the door of the Meridian opened. The afternoon traffic at the door was light and familiar, mostly people she recognized as regulars, and occasionally someone new, who had found the place through a recommendation. She looked up at the sound of the door the way she always did, with a neutral, welcoming expression that was part of the job. She did not, for the first half-second, recognize him. He was dressed differently from the last time she had seen him. On the Friday evening he had been in formal business clothing, fitted and dark and precisely appropriate for the environment. Now he was in what she could only describe as the clothing of a man who had dressed to be unremarkable. A plain jacket, a collarless shirt, dark trousers that were neatly pressed but without ceremony. He looked, in this context, like any other person who had decided to stop in for something on a Tuesday afternoon. But the stillness was the same. The particular, complete, absolute stillness of a man who was entirely present in whatever room he was in. Victor Harlow looked across the Meridian's afternoon floor and found her at the station, and he walked toward her section. She moved to meet him. "Good afternoon," she said. Her voice was exactly as it always was. "Good afternoon," he said. "Would you like to sit down?" "Yes, thank you." She showed him to a table, not table 14, which was occupied by a couple sharing a pot of tea, but a small two-top near the window that got the afternoon light well. He sat down. She set a menu in front of him. He looked at it briefly. "Just coffee, please," he said. "Of course." She went to the station and prepared the coffee. Her hands were steady. Her face was calm. The same face she brought to every table, every day, for 3 years. The face that was warm, without being over-familiar, and attentive, without being intrusive. She brought the coffee to the table. She set it down. He said, "Thank you." That was all. She went back to her other tables. She checked in with the couple at table 14, who were finishing their tea and beginning to look at the dessert menu. She went to the station and reviewed the afternoon reservation list. She did all of this with the same professional regularity that was the texture of her working day, and she did not look at the window table more than she would have looked at any other occupied table. He was there for perhaps 20 minutes. He looked out the window for most of it. He drank the coffee without appearing to rush it. He was not using his phone. He was not reading. He was simply sitting in a restaurant in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, with a coffee in front of him, and the low afternoon light coming through the window. And he looked like a man who was somewhere he had chosen to be, for reasons that were his own. She was at the station when she noticed that the window table was empty. She went to clear it. There was no bill. There was no card. There was, on the tablecloth, a folded piece of paper. She picked it up. She turned it over. It was a receipt, from the Meridian. It had the restaurant's name at the top, and the single item, 1 coffee, and the amount at the bottom. And on the back, in handwriting she did not recognize but which was clear and precise and deliberate, a short message, around the words, drawn with a red pen, 3 neat circles. The same number of circles as there had been on the receipt she had left for him. She read it. She stood at the window table in the afternoon light, with the receipt in her hands, and she read the words on the back of it, and then she stood there for a moment, doing nothing at all. The words said, "You saved my life. Name your price." And below the words, a business card with his name and the Harlow Capital address. And folded inside the business card, a single piece of paper, the confirmation of a bank transfer. She looked at the amount on the confirmation, $250,000. She stood at the window table for a moment. Then she walked through the kitchen and into the staff room, and she sat down at the small table with the folded receipt in her hands, and the business card, and the bank confirmation on the table in front of her. She looked at them for a long time. She thought about her apartment. She thought about the last payment of rent, which had been tighter than she liked, because the hours at the Meridian in February were always slightly less than the rest of the year, and she had a textbook she needed to buy for her final course, and had been putting off buying it. She thought about the gray metal box under the spare bed in her mother's house, and the small notebook in her drawer, and her father's red pen behind his ear for 22 years. She thought about the 3 credits standing between her and the criminal justice degree she had been working toward for 6 years across apartments and jobs, and the slow, steady reshaping of a life. She thought about what $250,000 meant in the context of those things. She thought about what it would mean to finish the degree without the constraint of calculating every hour of study against the number of hours she needed to work. She thought about what it might mean for Sandra, who was managing fine, but who was alone in the house with the apple tree, and who would not ask for anything. She thought about what it meant that a man she had met once, across a restaurant floor, had come back to a place that must have held a particular significance for him, alone, on a Tuesday afternoon, and had sat in the room for 20 minutes with a coffee, and then left a receipt with words on the back that mirrored, not accidentally, the form of what she had done for him. He had understood. Not just the practical value of what she had done, not just the outcome. He had understood the way she had done it, and he had answered in kind. She pressed the receipt flat against the table with her palm. She thought about the word price. She thought about whether there was a price. She thought about what her father would have said about that word in that context, and she knew exactly what he would have said, in the gentle and unequivocal way he said the things he believed. That doing the right thing does not have a price, because putting a price on it changes what it was. That the doing of it was its own complete thing, and that any payment attached to it afterward was something separate, and the person who received such payment had to decide for themselves what to do with the separation. She sat in the staff room with the afternoon running its quiet course outside the kitchen door, and she thought about all of this carefully. Then she reached into her apron pocket. She took out her red pen. She unfolded the receipt that Victor Harlow had left on the window table. She read the words one more time, and then she picked up the pen, and she turned the receipt over to the clean side, and on it she wrote one word, in the same clear hand she always used, and she drew a circle around it the way she always drew circles. Firm, deliberate, complete. The word was enough. She folded it and put it in an envelope she took from the small pad of stationery in the desk drawer, the pad that George kept for thank you notes to guests on special occasions. She wrote the Harlow Capital address from the business card on the front of the envelope in neat letters. She folded the bank transfer confirmation and the business card and put them in her bag. She would need to think about the transfer. Not tonight, but she would think about it. She finished her shift. She walked to the post box on the corner of the street outside the restaurant on her way to the car, and she put the envelope in the slot. She stood on the pavement for a moment, with her hands in her coat pockets. The afternoon had gone into evening while she was finishing the shift, and the city had changed around it the way it always did. The low light replaced by the lit windows of the buildings, and the yellow of the street lamps, and the moving lights of the cars on the road. It was cold and clear, and she could see one or two stars in the part of the sky that was visible between the buildings. She thought about her father. She thought about sitting on the floor of the spare room as a young woman, reading his case files in the gray metal box, reading the name Romano with the hard question marks, reading the case that had gone nowhere, and the single final line, subject has relocated. Trail ends here for now. She thought about the word now. Trail ends here for now. Not forever. Just for now. She breathed in the cold air. Then she walked to her car, and she drove home, and she made herself dinner, and she sat at the desk and opened the assignment she was working on, and she read what she had written the last time she was here, and she picked up the thread of it, and she kept going. She wrote for 2 hours. She thought it was some of the best work she had ever done. She saved it, and turned off the lamp and went to bed, and she lay in the dark for a while listening to the sounds of the city outside her window, the ordinary, continuous sounds of a world that kept moving, and she thought about one word circled in red, and whether it was enough. She decided that it was. She closed her eyes. She slept. The court proceedings lasted 11 days. Maya arrived at the courthouse on the 3rd day, which was the day she was scheduled to testify, and she sat in the witness waiting room for 2 hours before she was called. The room was plain and had 4 chairs along one wall and a window that looked out at a narrow section of the street below, and she sat in one of the middle chairs with her bag on the floor beside her and went over in her mind, one more time, the account she had been preparing for 4 weeks. She did not need to rehearse the content. She knew the content. She had known it from the moment it happened, and she had documented it carefully, and every time she had been asked to describe it since, in the staff room on the night itself, in Carter's conference room the following Tuesday, in the formal statement session with Hartwell, she had given the same account, because it was the account of what she had actually observed, and the account of what actually happened does not change with repetition. Only invented accounts change with repetition, because they are being maintained rather than remembered. Her account was not invented. She had sat at the table adjacent to 14 and heard 3 words from Elliot Crane's mouth, and she had stood at a server station and watched 2 men at a bar, with the particular watching that her father had spent 22 years practicing and passing on, and she had written 3 lines on a receipt with a red pen. These were the facts. She gave them clearly on the stand. The prosecution's counsel was a woman named Teresa Calder, precise and thorough, who took Maya through the evening in chronological order and gave her the space to give her answers without rushing them. The defense counsel, a man named Oliver Pembroke who had the professional confidence of someone accustomed to high-profile financial proceedings, cross-examined her for 45 minutes. He was looking, Maya understood, for inconsistency, for a gap between one version and another, for the slight shift in emphasis or timing that happens when someone is constructing an account rather than recalling one. He did not find it. He asked her about her qualifications. She told him she was a final-year criminal justice student and a waitress. He asked her whether she had any professional training in observation or threat assessment. She told him she had been raised by a detective who had taught her to pay attention. He asked whether her identification of a concealed item under the older man's jacket, from 20 feet away in ambient lighting, was not perhaps an interpretation shaped by what she had subsequently learned about those individuals. She said it was not. She said that she had identified the weight distribution in the jacket before she knew anything about the men, before she had heard the name Romano, and that the recognition was based on a specific visual pattern she had known since childhood. Pembroke moved on. He asked about the receipt. He asked whether she could have been mistaken about the words she heard Crane say. She said she was not mistaken. He asked her whether the name Romano could have been another word spoken in what he described as a noisy environment. She said the dining room at that particular moment was not noisy, and the word was a proper noun with a specific sound and rhythm, and she was not mistaken. Pembroke consulted his notes for a moment. He tried one more line of questioning, found no ground to gain on it, and sat down. The judge, a measured man named Carl Holt who had the settled authority of someone who had been doing this for a long time and found it neither dramatic nor tedious but simply the work of the position, thanked her for her testimony and told her she could step down. She stepped down. She collected her bag from the witness waiting room and walked out of the courthouse into the bright morning. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment. She thought about her father and what he would have thought about standing on the steps of a courthouse after testifying in a case that reached back, in a way he could never have known, to a thread he had pulled on 15 years ago. He would not have been dramatic about it. He would have been quiet and satisfied, and he would have said something about the work of it, about the patience of the process, about how these things move slowly, but they move. She thought he would have been glad. She went home. The verdict, when it came on the 11th day of proceedings. Elliot Crane was convicted on all counts. Leonard Romano, whose case had been proceeding in a parallel track, was convicted on the major charges against him. The sentences were announced 4 weeks later. Crane received 7 years. Romano received 12. She read about both in the evening news on her laptop, sitting at her desk, and she sat with the information for a long time. Not with the feeling of triumph, not with the specific release that dramatic stories sometimes attribute to moments like this, with something more like the feeling of a long breath that had been held for much longer than she realized, finally let go. She made tea. She called her mother. Sandra listened carefully to what Maya told her, the outline of it, the shape of the outcome, and was quiet for a moment when it was done. "Your father," Sandra said. "Yes," Maya said. "He would have said something very understated about this," Sandra said. "He would have," Maya said. "He would have said that the work takes as long as it takes." "That's exactly what he would have said," Sandra said. They talked for another 20 minutes about ordinary things, and then Sandra said goodnight, and Maya sat at her desk in the quiet apartment and looked at the desk lamp and thought about everything that had happened in the last 2 months. The semester was ending. She submitted her final assignment on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the verdict. It was on prosecutorial strategy in organized financial crime, and it was the best work she had produced in 6 years of part-time study, and she submitted it with the kind of certainty that comes from having spent a semester living the subject matter in the most direct way possible. She received a response from the department 3 days later. Her submission had been accepted with distinction, and with the accumulation of her course credits across the full program, She was confirmed as a graduate. She sat with the confirmation email open on her screen for a while. She had been working toward this, across 6 years and 3 apartments and 100 shifts at the Meridian, and one very specific Friday evening. And now it was done. She printed the email. She put it in a folder. 2 weeks after that, she received a letter from the financial aid office of the college. It informed her that a private scholarship, administered through a charitable foundation, had been applied retrospectively to her final semester's fees, which had been fully covered. The scholarship was described as being awarded to students demonstrating exceptional civic contribution. The foundation's name was listed in the letter. She looked it up. It took her 4 minutes to find the connection between the foundation and Harlow Capital. It was not hidden exactly, but it was arranged in the way that things are arranged when a person wants to make something happen without making it a story. She sat at her desk and looked at the screen. She thought about the receipt she had mailed back, the one word, circled. Enough. He had taken her at her word, and then decided that a scholarship, administered through a foundation, was a different category of thing. Something separate, as her father had said. The doing of the right thing, and any consequence that flows from it, are separate things, and what the person does with the consequence is up to them. She decided, after a while, that she agreed with this. She closed the laptop. She graduated on a Saturday in May. Sandra came in from the house with the apple tree and sat in the hall next to an older couple she had struck up a conversation with while waiting, and she waved at Maya when Maya came in with the other graduates, and her face had the particular brightness of someone who is very happy and is trying not to make the happiness too conspicuous. Maya looked at her mother in the hall and thought about her father, and then she looked straight ahead and walked with the line of graduates and collected what she had been working toward. She went home that afternoon with the framed certificate, which Sandra had insisted on a frame for, and had brought one from home just in case, and she put it on the desk in her apartment and looked at it. 6 weeks after graduation, she was at a community event in the city center. It was a fundraiser for the youth mentorship program she had been volunteering with for 2 years on her days off, a program that paired young people from difficult backgrounds with working professionals from a range of fields. She had been mentoring a 17-year-old named Kara who wanted to work in law enforcement and who had, in the course of their months working together, turned from a guarded and skeptical young person into someone who was beginning to believe that the goal was reachable. Maya enjoyed this work the way she enjoyed the restaurant. It required her to be in the room, fully, and to see what was actually in front of her, and to respond to it with what she had. The event was held in a large function room, with round tables and a small stage at one end, and it was full, 100 people, perhaps more. She had arrived early to help set up and was standing near the back of the room when she saw, across the space, a familiar figure. Victor Harlow was standing by the far wall. He was with 2 other people, one of them speaking to him with the manner of someone presenting information that required a response. He was listening with the still, complete attention she had seen in a restaurant 3 months ago. He looked the same quality of absolute presence, the same composed, unhurried way of occupying a room. And then, in the way that happens in full rooms, he looked up. He looked directly at her. She did not know if he had seen her before that moment, had known she was in the room, had come to this event in some way because of her connection to it. She did not know, and she decided, in the same instant that she decided it, that she did not need to know. He nodded. Once, clearly, deliberately. The nod of a person who recognizes another person across a room and means the recognition to be received. She nodded back. That was all. He looked back at the person speaking to him. She turned back toward the table she had been setting up, and she straightened the chairs, and she checked the water glasses, and she moved on to the next one. She did not see him again that evening. She drove home at 9:30, with the familiar satisfaction of an event that had gone well, that had raised what it needed to raise, that had put the people who were there in the same room at the same time for a good reason, and she was tired, in the good way that comes from a full day of useful work. She unlocked the door to her apartment. She turned on the lamp. She went to set her bag down on the desk, and on the desk, next to her framed degree, there was a small padded envelope that she did not remember placing there. She must have picked up the post on her way in earlier, and set it down without looking at it properly, which she sometimes did when she was in a hurry and thinking about something else. The envelope had no return address. Inside it was something wrapped in plain paper. She unwrapped it. It was a small frame, dark wood, the kind of simple, serious frame that holds one thing without drawing attention to itself. Inside the frame, behind the glass, was a photograph. Not a photograph of a person, or a place, or anything she might have expected. It was a photograph of a receipt, a restaurant receipt, photographed carefully against a flat surface so that both sides were visible, a front side and a back side, set side by side in the frame. On the front, the Meridian's header, and a Friday evening's items, and the total at the bottom. On the back, in her handwriting, in red ink, with firm circles around each one, 3 lines. And tucked behind the frame, folded once on plain paper, a note in handwriting she had now seen twice. She read it. It said, "Your father would have been proud. So am I." She stood at the desk with the frame in her hands and the note on the desk in front of her for a long time. The lamp made its quiet light. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, carrying on, carrying on, carrying on. She set the frame down on the desk, carefully, in the space next to her framed degree. She stood back and looked at both of them. The degree on the left, in its frame with the college's emblem at the top, and her name below it, and the date she had stopped waiting and started going. The photograph of the receipt on the right, in its plain dark frame, with 3 lines and 3 circles, and her father's handwriting, that was also somehow her own. She stood there for a moment, with her hands at her sides, and she let herself feel the fullness of everything that had happened in the months since a Friday evening at the Meridian, all of it settling into the quiet space of a well-lit room at the end of a long and useful day. The night of the dinner, the receipt, the 3 lines, her father's name in federal files, the gray metal box, the court proceedings, the 11 days, the verdict, the scholarship, her mother's face in the graduation hall, one nod across a crowded room. All of it. She felt it settle, the way things settle when they are finished and you are still standing. Then she pulled out the chair. She sat down at the desk. She reached into her bag and took out her red pen. She opened the folder for the first course of the next semester, which started on Monday, an advanced course in investigative procedure and evidence, the kind of course that would have made her father nod once, slowly, with the quiet approval he gave things that deserved it. She began to read. The lamp was steady above her. Outside, the stars were doing what they do when a city allows them, appearing, one by one, in the gaps between the lit things, quiet and permanent and patient, the way anything that waits long enough eventually does. She read until her eyes were tired. Then she set down the pen. She looked once more at the desk, at the degree, and the photograph, and the red pen lying beside the open folder. She turned off the lamp. She went to bed, and she slept, quietly and completely, the way a person sleeps when the work they have done is honest and the day is fully behind them. In the morning, she would get up. She would make coffee. She would open the curtains. She would sit back down at the desk, and she would pick up the red pen, and she would begin again. She always did,